Victoria walked into one of the most exclusive restaurants on the Upper East Side of Manhattan without a trace of hurry. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a sleek chignon, and she wore an ivory silk dress that moved like liquid, a slim leather portfolio clutched in her hands. The maitre Peter opened the heavy glass door with the practiced deference reserved for old money, and murmured a polite greeting, assuring her that her table was almost ready. Victoria did not reply immediately, her cool gaze drifting across the main dining room, taking in the golden ambient lighting, the towering arrangements of white orchids, and the crystal glasses that reflected the glittering New York City night outside. Near the enclosed terrace, Henry was leaning forward, carefully feeding a delicate piece of seared fish to Madison, with a level of tender devotion he had never shown when handing a simple glass of water to his own wife. Madison giggled, lightly touching his wrist, and praised him for spoiling her so much, to which Henry smoothly replied that she deserved to be treated like a real woman. Victoria heard it all without a flinch, without raising her voice, merely tightening her grip on the leather folder as she stood perfectly still among the oblivious elite. When Peter asked in a hushed tone if she would prefer a different table, Victoria looked at him with a chilling calmness and stated that she did not want that particular table at all. Henry had not noticed his wife in the first instant, too thoroughly absorbed in playing the role he adored above all else. The admired, powerful, wealthy man capable of turning any Manhattan dinner into a showcase of his own magnificence. Madison, however, caught sight of Victoria over Henry's shoulder, and instead of shrinking back in shame, she offered a small, victorious smile, clearly enjoying the thrill of sitting in the seat of a woman she believed she had defeated. She dragged out Henry's name with a venomous sweetness, announcing that his wife had arrived, causing his carefully rehearsed elegance to shatter instantly as the fork suspended in midair dropped with a clatter. Henry's jaw tightened as he stood up halfway, stammering that this was not what it looked like, but Madison merely rested her chin on her hand, her diamond earrings catching the light, and whispered that perhaps the wife needed to finally understand that their story was over. Victoria closed the distance to the table with measured steps, turning humiliation into a display of absolute protocol, while the entire dining room subtly quieted down to witness the unfolding high society scandal. Henry desperately tried to control the narrative before it escaped his grasp, leaning in to whisper a demand that she not make a scene in front of all these important people. Victoria simply tilted her head, asking him exactly what scene he thought she was going to make, while Madison let out a soft laugh, mocking how tasteless it was for an uninvited wife to ruin a lovely evening. Taking a good look at the mistress for the first time, Victoria catalogued the expensive pale green silk dress, the Italian designer handbag, and the platinum bracelet that matched a massive charge on her credit card statement from 2 months prior. A day Henry swore he was stuck in back-to-back meetings on Wall Street. Without raising her voice, Victoria noted aloud that her credit card statement had actually given her plenty of warning, a remark that made Henry grow visibly pale, while Madison, sipping her expensive champagne, arrogantly claimed she now understood why Henry complained his wife was too busy with spreadsheets to be a desirable woman. That insult hung in the air like an overpowering perfume, yet Henry chose to look away rather than defend his wife, a cowardly gesture that wounded Victoria far more deeply than the sight of him feeding another woman. She placed her leather portfolio on the empty chair, calmly stating that she did not need to step outside to discuss something he had possessed the audacity to do in public. Summoning the manager with a minimal gesture, Victoria waited as the nervous man scurried over, treating the situation as though he were walking on cracked glass, asking how he could be of assistance. Henry rushed to interject, loudly claiming that everything was under control, and demanding the check be brought later to the usual card on file, desperate to maintain his illusion of control. Victoria turned her face slightly toward the manager and asked if her next words were clear enough for the neighboring tables to hear, before declaring that the bill would remain in his name, but the card currently sustaining that table's luxury had just been permanently blocked. The silence that followed was profoundly cruel. Silver forks paused halfway to mouths, and Madison blinked, her smug smile freezing as she tried to decipher if this was an emotional threat or a terrifyingly practical reality. Henry's voice lost all its previous firmness as he warned her to be careful with her words, but Victoria simply unclasped her folder and produced a single, neatly folded bank receipt. She reminded him that she had been careful for 7 long years. Careful with his family name, his mother's fragile reputation, the elite dinner guests, and the late-night absences he had conveniently labeled as critical networking strategies. Madison, beginning to sense the structural collapse of her fairy tale, nervously asked Henry what card Victoria was talking about, but the man remained completely mute, entirely cornered by the truth. Victoria maintained her steady, low volume, explaining that the card was a supplementary one, linked directly to her personal inheritance account, the very same account that had paid for their imported wine, Madison's sparkling bracelet, and the rent for the luxury apartment over in Tribeca. She added that if she had not called the bank 20 minutes ago, it probably would have also funded the romantic getaway to the Hamptons they were planning for Friday. The mistress slowly lowered her crystal glass, her expression shifting from arrogant triumph to a cold, calculating panic as her mind raced through all the shopping bags, the spa reservations, and the lavish gifts she had assumed were funded by Henry's own immense success. Henry ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair and frantically claimed Victoria was exaggerating, accusing her of using money to manipulate and control him, which only drew a humorless half-smile from his wife. She calmly corrected him, stating that controlling him would mean stopping him from cheating, whereas she had merely decided to stop funding the betrayal out of her own pocket. The manager stood frozen, his eyes deliberately avoiding Henry's, fully aware now that the immense financial power guaranteeing their impossible. Reservations did not belong to the loud, charismatic Henry, but to the quietly wealthy Victoria. Attempting to salvage his bruised ego, Henry sneered, asking if she truly thought she could humiliate him over a simple restaurant bill, but Victoria countered that he had taken care of the humiliation himself the moment he decided to play the billionaire provider using someone else's money. When Madison weakly protested that she knew nothing about the financial arrangement, her rushed defense only betrayed her guilt, prompting Victoria to ask whether she didn't know he was married, or simply didn't know the card had a different woman's name on it. After Madison indignantly claimed Victoria had no right to speak to her that way, Victoria took a slow breath and clarified that she had reason, not right, which was exactly why her legal team would be reviewing every personal expense charged since the day Madison entered his life using the word love as a vault code. Henry's desperate demand for her to stop only resulted in Victoria turning her back on the table, leaving him to frantically produce 3 different credit cards from his own wallet, all of which were promptly declined by the machine with a humiliating beep that echoed across the dining room, signaling the definitive end of his masquerade. The illusion of boundless wealth began to silently fracture the very next morning within the sleek confines of the Tribeca apartment, where Madison had spent the night staring at the ceiling. First came an apologetic but firm phone call from the building's property management office, informing her that the automatic monthly draft for her lease had been rejected by the bank and required immediate alternative payment. Shortly after, an exclusive boutique in Soho sent a crisp text message stating that the designer dress she had placed on hold required a valid card by the end of the business day, or it would be returned to the sales floor. Finally, the private chauffeur service Henry frequently utilized called to inquire if they should maintain the itinerary for Friday, as the previous month's substantial invoice remained completely unpaid. Madison read the messages while sitting on the edge of the plush bed, still wearing one of Henry's oversized dress shirts, but all the triumphant intimacy of the previous evening had entirely evaporated. She coldly tossed her phone onto the mattress and demanded that Henry fix the situation, watching with growing disdain as he paced the hardwood floor, frantically pressing his phone to his ear, repeatedly telling various bank representatives that this was merely a temporary misunderstanding caused by an impulsive wife. Meanwhile, high above the bustling streets of Manhattan, Victoria sat in the immaculate glass-walled conference room of her family's corporate headquarters on Fifth Avenue, sipping black coffee. The traffic down below crawled like a river of yellow cabs and Blacktown cars, a testament to a city that never stopped to witness anyone's private heartbreak. Spread across the polished mahogany table were 3 neat stacks of financial documents, not weapons in the traditional sense, but undeniable boundaries made of paper and ink. Claire, the sharp and impeccably dressed family attorney, adjusted her glasses, carefully flipping through a folder of credit card statements before softly noting that Victoria should have initiated this financial lockdown years ago. Victoria accepted the mild reprimand without a hint of defensiveness, admitting she knew her delay was a mistake, while Claire warned that Henry would inevitably use that exact history against her, arguing that her prolonged silence equated to implicit consent. Wrapping her hands around the warm coffee mug, Victoria firmly stated that they would make it unequivocally clear to the courts that her payments were strictly to protect the family enterprise and reputation, never to secretly sponsor his extramarital affairs. Claire slid another heavy document across the table, tapping the cover page of the prenuptial agreement they had signed 7 years prior, a document Henry had breezed through with feigned romantic disinterest. Victoria traced the edge of the paper, recalling the sterile white room of the law office, the formal smiles, and Henry's charming rush to sign so he wouldn't be late for a lunch with potential investors, claiming he trusted her completely and that paperwork was just a minor detail. At the time, she had foolishly interpreted his negligence as a sign of absolute devotion. But looking back through the lens of betrayal, it was clearly just pure laziness wrapped in expensive cologne. She murmured that he had signed it without reading a single clause, to which Claire gave a firm nod, confirming that his ignorance did not nullify the ironclad protection of Victoria's family assets, personal accounts, and premarital wealth. The lawyer explained that while his misuse of the supplementary cards did not grant him any legal right to the origin of the funds, they needed to execute the separation of assets with surgical precision to avoid a messy public spectacle. Victoria took a deep breath, instructing her lawyer to avoid unnecessary exposure or illegal revenge, emphasizing that her only desire was to permanently sever her legitimate resources from his pathetic theater. Around noon, Henry bypassed the reception desk and appeared at the corporate offices unannounced, his presence signaling a desperation he tried to hide behind a tailored navy blue blazer and a forced aura of authority. Sarah, the loyal executive assistant, called into the conference room with a cautious tone, warning Victoria that her husband was demanding immediate entry and claiming it was a dire emergency. Claire immediately stood up, offering to remain in the room as a witness, and Victoria, staring out the window at the towering skyscrapers, agreed, instructing Sarah to let him in but to ensure he entered alone. When Henry barged through the heavy glass doors, his physical appearance was still flawlessly maintained, from his expensive watch to his perfect grooming, but his bloodshot eyes completely betrayed the panic of a man whose world was collapsing. He immediately accused Victoria of crossing the line, completely ignoring the lawyer's presence, until Victoria gestured to the empty chair and pointedly reminded him that just the night before, he had seemed to revel in having an audience. The precision of her remark struck him hard, causing him to remain standing as he angrily listed her offenses, blocking his personal payments, interfering with his daily schedule, and humiliating an innocent woman who had nothing to do with their marital issues. Victoria calmly opened one of the thick financial folders, countering that Madison had absolutely everything to do with it when she wore jewelry purchased by Victoria, lived in an apartment funded by Victoria, and dined at establishments where Victoria's name secured the table. Taking an aggressive step forward, Henry accused his wife of reducing a complex emotional breakdown to mere dollars and cents, because she could not accept that their marriage had naturally run its course. The sheer audacity of the statement stung, but Victoria refused to let the pain dictate her response, sharply correcting him that their marriage truly ended the moment he started treating her as both an unlimited ATM and a daily obstacle. When Henry turned his glare toward Claire and demanded to know if Victoria wanted an all-out war, the attorney calmly replied that her client merely sought proper asset regularization, noting that war is simply the dramatic term men use when women finally stop facilitating their lives. Henry clenched his fists, finding no surface to strike without looking utterly small, and finally collapsed into the chair, not out of politeness, but because his legs seemed suddenly incapable of sustaining his arrogant posture. He lowered his voice, attempting a manipulative plea by reminding Victoria of his father's fragile health and his mother's inability to handle a public scandal, arguing that if the truth leaked to the press, both their families would suffer immense collateral damage. Victoria listened to the sudden shift in his tone, recognizing the familiar tactic of dressing up a threat as genuine familial concern, an emotional weapon he had wielded successfully against her dozens of times before. She coldly pointed out the supreme irony of him, suddenly remembering his mother's delicate sensibilities only after parading his mistress through the very restaurant where his mother celebrated her birthday every single year. His face hardened as he admitted a minor fault, but quickly pivoted to accuse Victoria of transforming a private failing into a catastrophic public execution just to satisfy her vindictive pride. Leaning forward, Victoria dismantled his argument piece by piece, reminding him that he had held Madison's hand, fed her, and ordered expensive wine using a card explicitly authorized for their family's household expenses, making the only private thing about that dinner the origin of the money. Claire seized the moment of his stunned silence to slide a formal notice across the table, officially informing him that all supplementary cards were permanently cancelled, recurring authorizations were revoked, and any future charges attempted in Victoria's name would be heavily contested as fraud. Henry stared at the paper as if it were coated in poison, realizing with absolute clarity that Victoria had not acted in a fit of spontaneous jealousy, but had methodically planned her exit the moment she discovered his betrayal. By the time the afternoon sun cast long shadows over Manhattan, Henry's version of events was already slithering through the elite social circles of the Upper East Side, before Victoria had even finished her second cup of coffee. The gossip did not arrive in the form of a loud tabloid headline, but rather through the highly efficient, whispered network of the ultra-rich, incomplete sentences at charity luncheons, swiftly deleted social media stories, and text messages from women feigning deep concern while secretly relishing the drama. Madison, desperate to reclaim the narrative, posted a carefully filtered photograph of a solitary untouched glass of wine with a cryptic caption declaring that not all control comes disguised, as love conveniently tagging the location of the exclusive restaurant. Within 2 hours, a notorious society columnist published a thinly veiled blind item about a powerful New York heiress who was ruthlessly using her vast fortune to financially starve her straying husband out of pure, unadulterated spite. Victoria read the article in the quiet sanctuary of the back seat of her town car as it navigated the gray, congested streets of the city, feeling a cold wave of realization wash over her. Claire called immediately, warning her client not to issue any public response, wisely noting that the person who rushes to explain themselves usually ends up looking the most guilty to the unforgiving public eye. Across town, inside a sleek, glass-walled office in the financial district, Henry was pacing furiously in front of Ryan, a highly paid public relations consultant known for spinning corporate disasters into sympathetic redemption arcs. Ryan leaned back in his ergonomic chair, twirling an expensive pen, and coolly advised Henry that if he wanted to survive this socially, he needed to appear emotionally betrayed rather than financially inconvenienced. When Henry angrily protested that Victoria had literally frozen his entire life, Ryan raised a skeptical eyebrow, reminding his client that complaining about cancelled credit cards would only make him look like a spoiled dependent. The PR expert mapped out a devastatingly simple strategy. Henry must be portrayed as the emotionally starved husband driven away by a frigid, controlling heiress, while Madison had to be framed not as a gold-digging mistress, but as the warm, supportive woman who offered him genuine affection when his marriage was already a hollow shell. Henry remained silent, fully aware that the strategy was exceptionally dirty, but also recognizing it as his only viable lifeline to maintain his standing among his peers. When Henry worried aloud about the paper trail Victoria possessed, Ryan simply shrugged, stating that while documents are boring and exhaustive, a compelling emotional story always captures the public's imagination and loyalty. Meanwhile, Madison wholeheartedly embraced her assigned role as the tragic victim, sitting in her Tribeca flat wearing a simple white blouse, having stripped off her heavy designer jewelry to appear more vulnerable and unpretentious. She recorded a video on her phone, speaking in a trembling, hushed voice about how some powerful women believe they can simply buy people, cancel genuine feelings, and crush anyone who wasn't born with the right elite last name. She dramatically wiped away a tear, whispering that no one truly knew the agonizing reality behind a marriage of pure convenience, and that sometimes, finally being chosen by a man could bring immense, unexpected pain. After watching the recording 3 times, she noticed her wrist looked terribly bare without the platinum bracelet Victoria had identified. And for a fleeting second, the sheer hypocrisy almost made her delete the entire clip. However, the looming reality of her unpaid rent, the retained designer dresses, and the elite friends who would undoubtedly abandon her if she became ordinary again forced her hand, and she hit publish. Within an hour, she received hundreds of supportive comments from strangers who knew absolutely nothing about the truth. Yet she still felt a sharp stab of terror, because digital courage could never pay her mounting bills. Victoria did not shed a single tear when Sarah showed her Madison's video. Instead, she felt a dry, mature sorrow at witnessing her own quiet discretion being aggressively weaponized against her. Arriving back at her office, she found Claire waiting alongside David, a discreet, softly spoken financial advisor who specialized in untangling the complex webs of high net worth family portfolios. David placed a thick stack of bank statements on the desk, his expression grave, and informed Victoria that the financial abuse extended far beyond simple personal expenses and supplementary credit cards. He slid a summarized report forward, revealing that Henry had leveraged an informal, ambiguous corporate guarantee tied to Victoria's family trust to secure an entire lifestyle package, including private event spaces, luxury travel, and long-term hotel suites. The revelation hit Victoria like a physical blow. Henry hadn't just used her money, he had actively exploited her pristine financial reputation to maintain a massive line of credit for himself and his mistress. She remembered all the times she had blindly signed general authorizations to facilitate his corporate networking, realizing now that every act of efficiency and trust had been twisted into a deformed receipt for his secret life. The crushing weight of her own complicity in handing him the knife was quickly countered by Claire, who firmly reminded Victoria that providing access within the bounds of a marriage is not the same as offering permanent consent for betrayal. Anger finally eclipsed her lingering shame, and Victoria instructed David to audit every single line item, demanding to know exactly what was paid for, when the transactions occurred, and precisely who benefited from her name. That afternoon, a courier delivered a heavy, cream-colored envelope containing a summons, disguised as a polite invitation to tea, from her mother-in-law, Barbara, requesting her immediate presence at the family's Upper East Side townhouse to discuss the crisis. Claire strongly advised her to attend to prevent the narrative from solidifying in her absence, but warned her absolutely not to sign anything, make any promises, or accept a single ounce of blame for the fallout. The imposing townhouse looked exactly as it always had, with its towering iron gates, immaculate landscaping, and the distinct scent of fresh coffee and expensive lilies masking the tension within its walls. Barbara received her in the drawing room, wearing a tailored dark blue dress, sitting with the rigid posture of a matriarch who had spent her entire life confusing harsh sentences with high society elegance. To Victoria's profound shock, Henry was seated next to his mother, and directly across from them sat Madison, a tactical setup that instantly transformed a supposedly private family tea into a hostile tribunal. Stopping at the threshold of the room, Victoria coolly observed that she had expected a familial conversation, to which Barbara sharply replied that Madison's presence was entirely necessary for them to deal with reality. Henry actively avoided making eye contact with his wife, a cowardly detail that confirmed to Victoria he still preferred hiding behind a coordinated lie rather than facing the immense damage he had caused. Barbara took charge, speaking to Victoria as if she were a misbehaving subordinate, suggesting that intelligent women must sometimes make sacrifices, and proposing that Victoria quietly reactivate the funds until they could arrange a dignified end to the marriage. The word dignified almost forced a bitter laugh from Victoria as she stared directly at Henry, asking if they truly expected her to bankroll a comfortable transition period for his mistress, while they fabricated a clean timeline. When Madison attempted to interject, haughtily claiming the marriage was already dead anyway, Victoria calmly replied that it might have been dead, but it had certainly remained very well fed by her credit card. The heavy atmosphere in the drawing room grew completely rigid as Barbara slammed her antique teacup onto its saucer with deeply controlled fury, declaring that such blatant vulgarity did not suit a woman of Victoria's standing. Victoria recognized the familiar, suffocating trap. Whenever she dared to speak of concrete financial facts, the family labeled her vulgar, but when they orchestrated elaborate betrayals, they dressed it up as unavoidable reality. Henry finally found his voice, standing up and declaring loudly that he simply did not love her anymore, accusing Victoria of using her immense wealth to exact cruel punishment for his emotional honesty. She stared at the man who had slept beside her for 7 years, firmly replying that she had no desire to punish his lack of love, but she absolutely refused to continue paying the exorbitant operating costs of his indifference. Madison, losing her carefully crafted veneer of humility as panic set in, lashed out, accusing Victoria of acting superior just because she had money, claiming she herself had never needed to buy Henry's attention. Victoria turned her chilling gaze toward the mistress, asking why she had looked so terrified at the restaurant when the credit card was declined, if money truly meant nothing to their grand romance. Henry aggressively stepped between them, commanding Victoria not to speak to Madison in that tone, instantly providing the instinctive protection Victoria had craved for years but had only ever seen deployed for another woman. The realization was so profoundly painful that it temporarily robbed Victoria of her breath, allowing Barbara to capitalize on the silence by triumphantly claiming that this exact resentment would destroy whatever shred of respect remained between the two families. Victoria took a stabilizing breath and corrected her mother-in-law, stating clearly that there was no respect left to salvage, only raw accounting, and that the family would no longer use her humiliation as a limitless line of credit. It was in that moment of escalating tension that Barbara made a catastrophic tactical error, invoking the memory of Victoria's late father, claiming he understood that alliances between powerful families required total silence and certain pre-arranged conditions. Standing by the door, Victoria froze as the word conditions echoed in her mind, a concept that had absolutely no place in the narrative of the romantic courtship she believed she had experienced. Henry shot his mother a look of pure, panicked irritation, frantically trying to backpedal by claiming she was merely referring to the standard prenuptial agreement, but his terrified expression betrayed a much deeper, darker layer of deceit. Victoria immediately left the townhouse without finishing her tea, her mind racing back to the rushed engagement, the endless dinners where she was paraded around, and the intense pressure to merge their lives seamlessly. Sitting in the back of her car, she called Claire and demanded the lawyer retrieve every single archived document from the period of her engagement. Not just the final contract, but the drafts, emails, and any hidden annexes her father might have reviewed. Night had fully descended over Manhattan when Victoria returned to her empty apartment, the glittering skyline looking like a massive circuit board of tired, flickering lights, offering no comfort as she kicked off her shoes. Her phone buzzed with a manipulative text message from Henry, claiming his mother was experiencing severe health issues directly because of Victoria. Stubbornness, a classic attempt to trigger her deeply ingrained sense of guilt. Instead of rushing to call and apologize as she would have done in the past, Victoria visualized Madison sitting in that opulent drawing room and texted back a simple, devastating reply. She told him to call a doctor if his mother was unwell, but strictly forbade him from using an old woman's health as a shield to end a conversation he was too terrified to finish. In the dead of the night, around 2 a.m, Claire called with the results of her deep dive into the archives, confirming the existence of an old, highly confidential draft agreement negotiated between their fathers. The lawyer explained, without mincing words, that prior to the wedding, Henry's family real estate group was facing a severe liquidity crisis, and the strategic marriage to Victoria essentially stabilized investor confidence, saving them from total ruin. Her father had provided limited financial guarantees to protect her, but in exchange, Henry gained unprecedented operational access to the massive social and financial infrastructure of Victoria's family, essentially turning the marriage into a corporate bailout. Victoria leaned against the cold glass of her balcony window, squeezing her eyes shut as the past 7 years rearranged themselves with a cruel, geometric precision, revealing that her entire life as a wife had been a bankable asset. She realized that Henry's resentment stemmed from this very fact. He had always known he was bought and paid for, constantly reminded of his own inadequacy by her competence, leading him to seek out a woman who would blindly worship him. Less than an hour later, Henry unlocked the door to her apartment. He still had his key, still legally her husband, though the emotional reality of their union had died completely in that restaurant. He found her sitting in the dimly lit living room, wrapped in a heavy robe, the printed draft of the old family agreement resting ominously on the coffee table between them. All his rehearsed PR defenses vanished from his face the moment he saw the paper, his voice trembling as he asked where she had found it, attempting to argue that it was ancient history with no connection to Madison. Victoria laughed, a hollow, humorless sound, countering that it had everything to do with why his mother treated her like a useful utility and why he had confused financial access with an absolute, undeniable right. She stated that she had been rigorously trained to protect the image of a family that only viewed her as a walking, breathing collateral guarantee, wearing a wedding ring to seal a corporate merger. Defeated, Henry took a step forward, stripping away the last of his arrogance to confess the ugliest truth. He had started hating her because her immense capability constantly reminded him that he was not the self-made giant his family pretended he was. He admitted, with a rawness that finally sounded human, that he had chosen Madison specifically because she looked at him from below, offering the blind adoration of an audience member who had never seen the messy reality backstage. Victoria listened to this pathetic confession, the pain arriving clean and sharp, realizing he hadn't just betrayed her with another woman, he had betrayed her to maintain a desperate, fictional version of himself that he wanted to sell to the world. She looked at the old documents, then directly into his eyes, telling him that he was currently losing the only thing that had never required him to pretend, the only foundation that had actually kept him standing. When Henry quietly slipped out of the apartment, there were no slammed doors or dramatic exits, just a heavy, respectful closing that felt infinitely more tragic than any loud, explosive argument could have ever been. As the New York sky began to lighten with the approaching dawn, Victoria texted Claire, instructing her that she did not want to destroy anyone publicly, but she absolutely demanded that from now on, everyone would strictly pay their own way. The annual charity gala for the Joint Family Institute was traditionally billed as a night of boundless generosity, though everyone in the Manhattan social circuit understood that such philanthropy, served in a 5-star hotel ballroom, was primarily an exercise in raw power. Held at the iconic Plaza Hotel, the event featured massive crystal chandeliers, towering arrangements of white roses, waiters gliding effortlessly between round tables, and eager photographers waiting to capture the perfect, highly curated expressions of the city's elite. Both Barbara and Claire had strongly advised Victoria to attend, arguing that if she left her seat empty, Henry and his PR team would immediately fill the void with their carefully constructed narrative of the grieving, abandoned husband. Victoria arrived completely alone, wearing a stunning, deep sapphire gown devoid of any flashy jewelry, carrying herself with the unshakable calm of a woman who had already survived the absolute worst of her public humiliation in total silence. As she stepped into the grand ballroom, the ambient chatter noticeably dipped for a fraction of a second. Not long enough to be overtly rude, but entirely sufficient to confirm that the entire room had consumed the latest tabloid gossip. She caught the curious stares, the falsely sympathetic smiles, and the subtle nods from socialites like Eleanor, who had undoubtedly spent her morning dissecting the rumors of Victoria's alleged financial cruelty over mimosas. Henry made his grand entrance 15 minutes later, with Madison clinging to his arm, executing a masterclass in calculated optics. He wore a flawless bespoke tuxedo, while she was dressed in a demure, champagne-colored gown with minimal makeup. The strategic choice was glaringly obvious to anyone paying attention. They were trying to rebrand her from a home-wrecking mistress into a supportive life partner, turning a scandalous affair into a narrative of brave new beginnings. Barbara, looking pale and tense beneath her layers of practiced elegance, greeted them warmly near the head table, attempting to force the high society crowd to accept Madison's presence as an undeniable established fact. Henry worked the room, shaking hands with powerful CEOs and murmuring somber phrases, while Madison softly touched his arm, telling anyone who would listen how incredibly strong Henry had been during these immensely difficult times. Watching the performance from her seat, Victoria remained entirely motionless, prompting Claire, seated to her right, to whisper that they were actively trying to provoke a reaction, to which Victoria coolly replied that they were about to be severely disappointed. The first direct attack came wrapped in a toast, as Barbara took the stage to speak about family unity and the strength required to weather unfortunate misunderstandings, weaponizing the word to dismiss 7 years of Victoria's loyalty. Shortly after, Barbara invited Henry to the microphone to officially launch the Institute's new philanthropic phase, and he immediately used the platform to address the swirling rumors, staring briefly at Victoria before addressing the massive crowd. He declared with practiced solemnity that his personal life had recently been subjected to cruel financial interpretations, but he had learned that true character is not measured by control over bank accounts, but by the capacity to keep serving others when wounded. A ripple of sympathetic murmurs washed over the tables, and Madison lowered her eyes, perfectly playing the part of the unjustly persecuted woman standing by her noble, suffering man against the wrath of a bitter heiress. Taking the manipulation a step further, Henry publicly thanked the woman who had stood by him out of pure love, extending his hand to invite Madison up onto the stage, drawing a round of polite but painfully sharp applause. Victoria felt a fleeting flash of the original pain from the restaurant, the image of the fork in his hand, the declined card, but it was quickly overwhelmed by the memory of the secret family contract and the realization that she owed them nothing. As the master of ceremonies stepped up to announce the mundane administrative portion of the evening, Victoria stood up, her movement so fluid and calm that the room didn't fully register the disruption until she began walking purposefully toward the stage. At the charity gala, Victoria calmly took the stage and publicly ended every financial privilege tied to her name and family accounts, exposing the reality behind Henry and Madison's lavish lifestyle. When Henry tried to defend himself and Madison accused Victoria of acting out of jealousy, Victoria revealed that she was no longer willing to fund their choices. The situation collapsed completely when a hotel manager accidentally announced over a live microphone that Madison's luxury suite authorization had been declined. In that moment, Henry's borrowed power vanished, and Victoria realized she had not destroyed him. She had simply stopped supporting the illusion that had protected him for years. The next morning, Victoria woke in her smaller but peaceful apartment, feeling freer than she had in years. While the media praised her composed handling of the scandal, Henry sat in his office confronting the truth that much of his success had depended on Victoria's support. Madison quickly learned how cruel high society could be as invitations disappeared and people stopped returning her calls. Later, Henry met Victoria in a quiet cafe and without excuses admitted his failures. He outlined a plan to repay the money he had diverted and confessed that Madison represented a fantasy, while Victoria had always seen him clearly. Victoria accepted his apology, but made it clear that rebuilding his life was his responsibility, not a path back to her. As the scandal faded, Victoria finalized the divorce, severed all financial ties between her family's trust and Henry's ventures, and accepted an invitation to speak about financial independence, personal boundaries, and rebuilding dignity after betrayal. Addressing women from many backgrounds, she explained that true victory is not defeating a cheating partner, but refusing to continue financing a lie. She emphasized that love should never come at the cost of self-respect, and that endless patience is not the same as virtue. Leaving the auditorium, Victoria understood that real freedom is not revenge. It is reclaiming your boundaries, ending the support that sustains other people's illusions, and finally choosing yourself without guilt or fear.